Welcome back to the, I'm going to ask you to take your seats. I have promised timely dismissal to all. So thank you for being back here for the second half of our scholarly editing symposium sponsored by the Lewis Walpole Library. A quick announcement, many of you who were up at the Walpole last evening may not have realized that there is an exhibition catalog that accompanies Stephen Clark's fantastic exhibition on the Walpoles. So if you did not realize there was a catalog and would like one, please be in touch with Nicole Boucher. By email. We will find a way to make sure that you get a copy. Okay, so that's a brilliant idea. If you have a card, leave it with Nicole with a little note, and we'll make sure you get one. All right. Well, the morning session was fantastic. We are looking forward to more fantastic here in the second session. Again, I'll introduce each speaker individually. For the Q&A, and I'll remind you when we get there, please, if you're on mic, introduce yourself before you give your question. All right. Our first speaker this afternoon is Gordon Turnbull, who is the general editor of the Yale Boswell Editions. His latest volume, the fourth and final, is the genetic transcription manuscript edition of The Life of Johnson, edited by Thomas Bonnell, and is now in press. Some of you may not know this, but Gordon also curates crossword puzzles based entirely on Samuel Johnson. See one of those, guilty. Several other volumes of the Yale Research Series, the Boswell's Journals and Correspondence, are in advanced states of editorial preparation. And the next to appear in 2020 will be the correspondence of James Boswell and Sir William Forbes of Pitsligo, thank you, edited by Richard Scher. Gordon has taught, written, and lectured widely on Boswell, Johnson, and their circle. He's an annual speaker at the Boswell Book Festival in Dumfries House in Ayrshire, Boswell's ancestral county, devoted to the practice of biography and memoir. His Penguin Classics edition of Boswell's London Journal, 1762 to 1763, the first comprehensive re-editing of this famous diary since Frederick Pottle's Modern Spelling worldwide bestseller of 1950, appeared in 2010 and has been reprinted 3 times since. He is also the best lunch buddy that a lonely visiting scholar ever had. Gordon Turnbull.
The basic outline of the Boswell story is pretty generally known. James Boswell was known to literary history for the century and a half after his death in 1795, essentially as Samuel Johnson's biographer, until a series of unexpected manuscript recoveries, first in the mid-19th century, of a good number of his personal letters with his closest friend, the Reverend William Johnson Temple, which helped fuel the work of G.B. Hill and others in drawing Boswell out from Johnson's enormous shadow and investigating him in his own right, which led eventually up to the decisive and pioneering work of Chauncey Brewster Tinker in the early 20th century at Yale. Then, in the 20th century, a massive set of manuscript recoveries made by Colonel Ralph Hayward Isham, seen there in a grainy black and white newspaper picture, from Malahide Castle in Ireland, home to the Talbot family, Boswell's descendants. That is the 6th Lord Talbot on the right, and the glamourpuss on his right is Joyce Gunning Kerr, Lady Talbot, who was the prime mover in rediscovering the ancestral papers and the first apparently to sense their editorial, literary, and more to the point, commercial possibilities. She and Colonel Isham charmed each other. Colonel Isham was a swashbuckling kind of a fellow, quite a character, who told the story later that in the end he allowed Lady Talbot to sell him the Boswell paper. Then there was a second great discovery while Isham's edition of the private papers was well along at Fettercairn House in Scotland, home to the descendants of Boswell's executor, the eminent Edinburgh banker Sir William Forbes of Pitsligo. Then came their acquisition by Yale and the ongoing publication of selections of these papers. The catty review that Stephen put up this morning by J.H. Plum referred to the fact that every single syllable Boswell wrote was going to be published. That was never true. The collection is about 40%, thank heavens. In fact, the whole Boswell collection in Yale's Beinecke Library spans 6 centuries. The 1740 to 1795 James Boswell component is just a fraction of the larger Boswell collection that goes back to medieval estate documents up until family correspondence of the 20th century. The Yale Boswell Editions have published selections of these, which has brought about wholesale changes in the meaning of the authorial trope or signature of Boswell, what it means to be Boswell or Boswellian, and to Boswellize. I will quote Ronald Hutch's review of Paul Tankard's recent edition. I think it is superb that in the world of James Boswell, a pottle has been followed by a tankard. Recent edition of Facts and Inventions, selections from the journals of James Boswell, Yale University Press, 2014, says Ronald Hutch. Known universally for his life of Samuel Johnson, James Boswell was actually also a rollicking writer of essays, letters, and doggerel, as well as newspaper and journal magazine articles. He had a vast range of interests, and the sheer volume of his writings is staggering, as Boswell himself often was. He also reveals a substantial knowledge of things English, Scottish, North American, and classical. This is in addition to his musings on crime, punishment, literature. This was not unusual for an educated child of the Enlightenment. But the lack of self-consciousness and amoral jauntiness that Boswell displays is compelling. To read Boswell's writings in their many varieties is to experience the good and the not so good in the culture of the British Isles during the late 18th century. There's been a certain fossilization of the way in which Boswell's patronymic has stuck in dictionaries. Here is the OED. Boswell, noun, used allusively for a constant companion or attendant who witnesses and records what a person does. 1892, Conan Doyle, Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, says, Watson, I think that I had better go, Holmes. Not a bit, Doctor. Stay where you are. I am lost without my Boswell. 1932, Nancy Mitford, Christmas Pudding, Chapter 3, page 41, I never thought of biography, but of course that's the very thing for me. May I be your Boswell, darling? It could have several other unintended meanings when you think about it. The verb to Boswellize, transitive verb, to treat in the Boswellian manner, to observe and record the actions, etc. of someone. The OED's illustrative examples cut out revealingly in the 1930s, the decade in which Colonel Isham's privately printed edition of the Malahide Papers were making their sequential appearances amidst huge blazes of publicity, inaugurating the removal of Boswell from Johnson's shadow and the dismantling of the myth that Boswell himself fashioned of a life lived more or less in constant, devoted, and even servile stenographic attendance on the great Cham. The authorial Boswell, for most of his life, was a busy professional lawyer practicing in Edinburgh, and he was laird of a large estate, Auchinleck, in Ayrshire, and he was known for most of his life in the press as Corsica Boswell. From the account of Corsica, his first important book, which appeared in 1768, as we discovered when we were at a seminar at the University of Corte in June of this year, Boswell is still revered on that island very seriously. He's seen there as something the way Byron is seen in Greece. In a recent fine article, David Bell of the History Department at Princeton documents the remarkable impact Boswell's first book had and his image of General Pasquale Paoli had on pre-revolutionary North America. The name of Paoli, because of Boswell's book between 1768 and 1776, appeared 3,000 times in the American press and played a great part in forming the iconography of George Washington himself. Boswell was known after Corsica as a prolific and wide-ranging newspaper and magazine journalist. In our own time, since the manuscript recoveries and the publication by the Yale editors, he's more known as a candid and even disturbingly confessional autobiographer. He was known for only a small fraction of his life, essentially his rather jowly middle age, as the immortalizer of the even jowlier Samuel Johnson. Now the Johnsonian Boswell is in a sort of reputational parenthesis. The newspaper and magazine journalist early in his life, the confessional, candid autobiographer in our time. And the seemingly eternal dyad has to some extent been separated. In certain ways, this development has gratified the world of specialist Johnsonian scholarship. That particular population breaks kind of into two separate camps: those who saw Boswell as a deeply devoted recorder who wrote the greatest biography in any language. And even if not that, he wrote an inexhaustible and endlessly rereadable, quotable repository of sinewy and provocative aphoristic wisdom. When a man is tired of London, he is tired of life. Second marriages are the triumph of hope over experience. The Irish are a fair people. They never speak well of one another. And one which is making a remarkably frequent range of appearances these days, patriotism is... Don't even need to say it. The last refuge of a scoundrel. And those who said, no, Boswell was no more than a parasitic mediocrity who, hungry for a literary immortality he himself did not warrant, attached himself to the great man and produced basically a book full of distorted honor or table talk that is a colossal misrepresentation of the real or the authorial Johnson. In the late, great Donald Green's witty and angrily amusing word, the life of Johnson should be repealed. Well, I'm suggesting, and will suggest a bit further later in these remarks, that in some ways it has been, with Boswell himself in curious ways leading the repeal campaign by shifting the focus of his writing back to the auto-Boswellizing and getting us to refine our own vision of just what that is, meaning that there is far more to Boswell's private writings than just the personal presence of Boswell's self in them. He was a collector of people. He liked writing down the fascinating things they said, and with Johnson, he of course hit the mother lode. But there are millions of shadow little biographies in Boswell's writing. And second, he left us the whole mass of his huge hoard of working papers, out of which he put together the life for us to make our own selections from. The meaning of the signature Boswell, I said, has changed. He handed it off to posterity. If you do not like what I did in the life of Johnson, here, do it yourself and do it better. This is what I culled it all from, and he inaugurated a remarkably busy post-Boswellian era of Johnson biographies. There are many of them, each of which claiming to undo or outdo Boswell while concurrently plundering him as a source. So I'll return to the life manuscripts towards the end. 20th and 21st century attention falls, for the most part, on the confessional candor of the private diaries, which have attracted many readers, but inevitably repelled others. But how ahead of the 20th century vogue for soul-bearing, warts and all autobiographical memoir he was in his confessionality and the public courting of indignity and humiliation as a therapy or assuagement for the pains and depressions of life. When I myself was suffering from some medical indignities about a decade ago, I, with nothing better to do, inflicted upon myself 2 consecutive weeks of American daytime television and was shackled to my sickbed by chains of disbelief about what people were confessing to on national television. Boswell began to seem to me a paragon of reticence and pudicity, self-effacement. But this is in some ways a phenomenon his own London journal induced, a point I'll come back to in a while. In my own reading, Boswell's diaries, like the life of Johnson itself, and like his series of essays as the hypochondriac, meaning a depressive, these essays are under-regarded in my view and are now gratifyingly coming in for some renewed appreciation, belong to traditions inaugurated by such things as the Book of Job. They are wisdom literature, comfort literature, perhaps even self-help literature. The private journals, after recovery and publication by the Yale editors, plainly struck a post-World War II chord with their records of existential yearning. Boswell's inner urgent restlessness, a postmodern sense avant la lettre of alienation and drift, fed by and feeding a hunger for celebrity, both as authorial fame and a more general media notoriety, which provided for Boswell, and people now on Bookface and Instagram and ChatterTwit and all the things I know nothing about, providing an anchor for identity which the roles assigned to him in life, circumstances of birth, place, station, and profession, just did not gratify. He was actuated by a restlessly ambitious emotional agitation. Fermentation was his own favorite word. It never quite fully formed, that craved a validation and a forgiveness by placing itself, like the people on Jerry Springer and so forth, in the public gaze. Back briefly to the story of the recovery of the papers and to Yale's very risky and, in my own view, deeply unwise decision to acquire them. But and then set about the editing of them in 2 separate editions, a trade or reading edition of the journals in modernized prose with ridiculous novelistic titles such as Boswell in Search of a Wife, Boswell for the Defense, Boswell the Ominous Years. We young twerps in the early 1980s changed all the titles to Boswell in Need of Defense, Boswell in Search of a Life, and Boswell the Ignominious Years. And a separate concurrent research series of journals, correspondence, and the manuscript of the life of Johnson and its scores of related documents, rather than just acquire the papers and house them in Yale's libraries for researchers to come and consult. News about the Malahide discoveries by Colonel Isham spread and flew around the world and were found stuffed in the now famous ebony cabinet, which was acquired by Mary Hyde, later in life Lady Eccles, from the last auction at Auchinleck House, and at her death she bequeathed it to the Beinecke Library, which I think on the whole did not actually want it. But there it is, there now, sort of stored deep in the bowels of the place, out of sight. And it's fueled a great competition among the major universities to get these papers. Here we have a letter by the Harvard librarian George Winship to Professor Robert Blake. There is, of course, no possible doubt about the extraordinary importance of the Boswell documents which Colonel Isham has, either from a literary point of view or the very high value from that of book collectors. That is not actually a sentence. Harvard, it's just Harvard. I can imagine no greater tragedy for literary scholarship, nor one which for all time be increasingly regarded as a reflection on the far-sightedness of American benefactors than to have this collection broken up and dispersed through the sale of the individual pieces at auction. He's very correct about that. Taken as a whole, as it now stands, I doubt if there has ever yet come upon the market a collection which touches a greater range of perennial human and literary interests. The people who wrote these papers have an assured place in literary annals, and as a group, they make up for falling just below the topmost of fame by the unequaled appeal of their personalities as human beings. One special reason would make it particularly delightful if we can get these papers for Harvard. This is the fact that for many reasons Yale wants them. Very much indeed. The man on the Yale faculty whom we envy Yale more than anyone else is Chauncey Tinker. Could we make Tinker come up to the Harvard Library for the material which he can interpret better than anyone else now living? It would give some of us a very pleasant feeling. We who know the Harvard Library best have no serious fear of the rivalry of Yale, but the new Yale building is going to give them a great impetus, and Yale men are frankly determined to make their collection better than ours if they possibly can. I cannot think of any single thing of any sort which would put us further ahead and make the stern chase more hopeless than these Boswell papers. Oh, well. We won. To Yale they eventually came. Yale gets Boswell's papers. Don't read the second bit of that headline. One of the earliest moments of fake news in it. That's very painful to look at. That's Colonel Isham in the middle of 2 Yale librarians. After much arduous effort by the heroic Ralph Isham, who ruined both his health and his finances in the process, here they are being carried in metal tins under armed security guard. It's a particular delight for all of us concerned that the policeman on the extreme left is named Edmund Malone. That is true. So the task of editing began under the direction of the remarkable Frederick Pottle. There he is as an elderly man. He was born in 1897, and with that same sense of Augustan balance and synthesis which characterized his footnotes, he died in 1987. He was one half of a remarkable wife and husband team with Marion Pottle, on whom unremunerated the main burden of sorting and cataloguing fell. Yale wanted the papers but would not buy them itself. Yale's financial relationship to the whole enterprise has been fraught throughout. An unsolicited grant of $300,000 of 1948 money, which was extraordinary, came from Paul Mellon's Old Dominion Foundation. That was still not enough for what Colonel Isham wanted. A deal was struck for commercial publication rights with the McGraw-Hill Book Company, with Heinemann operating for them in the United Kingdom. This proved a very problematic and even Faustian bargain. And we, current editors, who, like all human beings on the earth in the Harold Bloomian formulation, are belated, we both stand on the shoulders of giants and suffer from the sins of the fathers. With 2020 hindsight, or even 2019 hindsight, we can see that the ambition to edit all of these papers was misplaced. Indeed, by the end of the 1960s, Pottle and his collaborators came bleakly to know they had probably baked in an unfinishability. The deal with McGraw-Hill was a way of getting the papers 6 centuries worth, as I said, to Yale, but it had the knock-on effect of skewing the whole editorial trajectory. It meant that the editorial time, effort, and talent in the early decades went into producing the chunks of journal with their novelistic titles, designed at first to gratify the needs of a northeastern American, urban, white, middle-brow, Book of the Month Club reading demographic. The early correspondence of the editors shows that pretty much the entire decade of the 1950s, after the first set of acquisitions, apart from the initially pretty brisk production of the trade volumes, was devoted to deep indecision and disagreement about how to recruit editors and how, quite fundamentally, to organize the concurrent research series. Should the letters just go chronologically? Should they be divided up into subject volumes? Should they be done by selected individual correspondent, or just one chronological series from letter 1 up to letter 385 trillion, which is what it seemed. After the mad, frantic scramble to get the papers, the reality had to be confronted. What does the dog do once it has caught the car? No plan or apparatus was in place, and no decisions about how to categorize the correspondence, and there was no institutional funding. The schemes kept coming into being on the fly, with a central editorial office trying to coordinate the work of literature and history professors at other universities, who could, of course, only work on these volumes in summers and sabbaticals, the system which still now fundamentally obtains. This meant a hurried and basically impossibly steep learning curve in the details of Scottish law, society, agricultural management, and so on, not in the immediate possession of any known American professors of literature. This is Pottle writing in 1953. My thanks to Andrew Heisel for retrieving these quotations I'm about to use. He's been attending to the electronic storage of some of the early meta-history of the project as a hedge against possible future loss or Gothic or barbaric destruction. We do not know how many trade volumes there will be. The publishers are under no obligation to continue this series and will do so only so long as it makes money. At the most, it will hardly run to more than 12 or 15 volumes. That prediction was quite accurate. The publishers are under contract to print all the significant papers in the research edition, so that edition will run to at least 30 volumes. The project will take 20 years or more to complete. That the initial target completion date was 1973. Here is the chairman of the English department, Frederick Ted. No, it's not. Go back. I got ahead of myself somehow. Yeah. Ted Hillis to Alexander Faulkner, 1956. I was reading yesterday a number of letters which Boswell wrote in 1787 and 1788, in which he predicts his Life of Johnson will be published in the next 6 months. It came out in 91. It made me think of our project. I had assumed several years ago that by now we should have produced 2 or 3 volumes of the letters. I have learned not to make predictions. That was 1956. He expected 2 or 3 to be out. The first volume of letters appeared 10 years after this letter in 1966. Here is Fred Pottle writing in 1969. The best plan, I think, would be for me to live another 50 years. But I'm not sure that can be arranged. This makes me think of Robinson Crusoe and his first attempts to build his damned canoe. And he made it too big to get it down to the water, so he starts trying to get the water up to the canoe, and that doesn't work either. That final sentence there, this grieved me heartily. And now I saw, though too late, the folly of beginning a work before we count the cost and before we judge rightly of our own strength to go through with it. The early editors came to find that the annotating of the research series on the now famously dense and detailed scale that they settled on combined with the sheer scale and sheer mass of never-before-published manuscript materials that were never designed for publication, with editors developing an expertise in them only in the process of actually beginning to work on them, bore no realistic relationship to the time span of the typical academic career, or even, for that matter, as in Pottle's rueful letter of 1969, the human lifespan itself. The list of editors in the Boswell Project who took on volumes and failed to see them through to completion is a good deal longer than editors who have actually successfully completed them. Nonetheless, this project can point to an extraordinary and ongoing record of editorial achievement, the outcome of a humbling and remarkably dedicated, patient, and often lonely and isolating kind of work. And the consequent impact of Boswell himself on modern biographical and autobiographical practice has been enormous as the result of this work and is enduring. The trade or reading series of the journals began with Pottle's edition of the London Journal of 62.3, which surprised everybody by becoming a runaway worldwide bestseller, instantly recouping the money McGraw-Hill had paid for the commercial publication rights. And the series concluded after much upheaval and the perennial funding struggles with Boswell the Great Biographer, 1789 to 95, edited by Marlies Danziger and Frank Brady. Quoting Northrop Frye, reviewing Pottle's 1950 edition, the London Journal, Boswell had been composing with all his usual tact and skill his letter of introduction to posterity, which has taken much longer to be delivered, but should give him the last word. Not everybody was, of course, pleased. There is Caspar Milquetoast, the timid soul, throwing his own diary into the fire after having read Boswell's London Journal of 1762.3, said, I'm not going to have people 200 years from now reading how I carried on as a boy. Much more seriously than that, this is a panel at last year's ASEX conference in Denver, Colorado, paper number 4, reading the 18th century in the light of the Me Too movement, known offenders. There's Boswell with Mozart and liaison dangereuse and so forth. This is a serious conversation and one that needs to be had, but a trickier one for another occasion. At the other extreme, here is this remarkably improbable thing, an excerpt of the Louisa episode in which Boswell gets the actress Louisa into bed and is 5 times in one night lost in supreme rapture and spends the rest of his journal strutting around London, proud of himself and imagining he's one of the wits of Charles II's time, only to discover he has caught gonorrhea from the experience. It turned up in this, his entries from 24, 25, and 26 of December 1762 in an anthology called Joy to the World, 2,000 Years of Christmas. Under the heading, James Boswell's Christmas Romance, 1762. I would not have believed this had I not been written to for permission to quote the material. 13 trade volumes in all, plus an edition of portraits by Sir Joshua Reynolds, 16 so far in the research series, counting the invaluable 3-volume analytic catalogue, most of which are research volumes of correspondence, it having been decided to give priority to those, the journal already existing. As Misty mentioned in the introduction, the 4-volume sequence of the genetic transcription of the manuscript of the life of Johnson is now complete, with volumes 3 and 4 having been completed by Thomas Bonnell, the sequence having been inaugurated by the late, great Marshall Waingrow. This 4-volume sequence is by any measure one of the great textual editorial achievements of modern times or any time, tracing Boswell through first drafts, through innumerable revisions and additions and deletions, through to published completion. Thomas Bonnell, working on volumes 3 and 4, has put in thousands of hours of dogged and painstaking granular work. If, as is sometimes said, the true test of morality is to do what you do when there's nobody there to see what you're doing, and possibly even not knowing you're doing what you're doing, Tom Bonnell now stands on the very brink of beatification. Am I running over? Yeah. All right. Here we go. This is the sort of scholarship that we have the knock-on effect of producing. We are not only scholarship in ourselves, we are the cause of scholarship that is in others. I just want to put that up there so I can read the review of it by John Mullen. Sismon's work relies everywhere on the unsung Boswell scholars who, over half a century, have made the Yale edition of the Boswell Papers one of the great editorial achievements of modern times. These are other books that we have made possible. That's what the life of Johnson looks like. It's a neat book. That's what the manuscript of the life of Johnson looks like, and it takes some decoding. A few quick examples, 3 quick examples of the way in which readings of the life manuscript changed the detail of the life. These are 3 examples of possibly thousands. This will just be what a student paper I once received in one of my all-time favorite phrases that I've now made my own. This will be a synecdoche for the whole. Not quite 3-year-old Samuel Johnson is in Lichfield Cathedral observing the great preacher Henry Sacheverell preaching. The Life of Johnson says that he was sitting on his father Michael Johnson's shoulders, gaping at the much celebrated preacher. Is he gaping? Gazing, yes. So from just before his 3rd birthday until his 310th, Johnson has been in the undignified condition of gaping at Henry Sacheverell at Lichfield Cathedral, thanks to the beady eye of the Yale Boswell Editions. No more. Boswell was not in London when Johnson died. He relied on a letter from his brother David to provide the details. His brother David wrote this letter. Boswell said that at Johnson's death, Frank Barber and Mrs. de Mullins, the elderly Mrs. Elizabeth Swinfen de Mullins, were present in the death room. She was nowhere near the place. Boswell simply mistranscribed his brother's letter. It says Mr. Barber and Mr. de Mullins. That is Elizabeth de Mullins' son, John, who was an interesting fellow in his own right. What stone did Johnson kick when he decided to refute Bishop Berkeley's immaterialism? You Google that one and all kinds of things come up. It's amazing what people have speculated upon. Johnson kicking a stone in the middle of Fleet Street, I remember, with no sense of how a boulder actually got into the middle of Fleet Street. And what the devil do we have here? This is, here he is trying to bend it like Beckham, a striker for the Lichfield lexicographers. Recently drawn to our attention by Matthew Davis of the University of Virginia in the latest issue of the Johnsonian newsletter. We have to allow for some deliberate whimsy. I mean, he's on the brink of shattering his own foot into about 1,000 pieces. This is by a sculptor called William Forbes, commissioned by the quirky Felix Dennis, the countercultural publisher of Oz magazine, who later became very wealthy. He built his whimsical garden of heroes and villains near Stratford-on-Avon in Warwickshire. Galileo, Bob Dylan, the White Queen from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, to the original manuscript. We went and looked at the church, and having gone into it and walked up to the altar, Mr. Johnson, whose piety was constant and fervent, sent me to my knees, saying, "Now that you are going to leave your native country," Boswell was about to leave England to go to Utrecht for law study, "recommend yourself to the protection of your Creator and Redeemer." After we came out of the church, we stood talking for some time together of Bishop Berkeley's ingenious puzzle, sophistry, to prove the non-existence of matter, and that everything in the universe is merely ideal. I observed, that though we are satisfied his doctrine is wrong, not true, false, not true, it is impossible to disprove, refute it. I shall never forget the alacrity with which Johnson answered, striking his foot with mighty force against one of the large projecting foundation stones of the building. Deleted a large stone till he rebounded from it. I refuted thus. Johnson delivered a Morstead-like bomb to a foundation stone of the Church of St. Nicholas in Harwich. The church was suffering from structural decay and was demolished and replaced by another church of the same name later. James Caudle drew attention to this incident in an essay 12 years ago and spoke for all of us when he said he hoped the structural decay requiring the church's demolition and replacement was not actually exacerbated by the kicking it took from Johnson. In this and 1,000 other ways, the life of Johnson is not the same as it was. It is not the monumental and unchanging thing it is sometimes projected to be. It is a hypertext, changing, updates itself with each living period, and Boswell has given it to us and to the Yale Boswell Editions to make a better life out of it than he did, if we think we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Oh, wow. These are the jokes, people. These are the jokes. I feel we should start a 2-drink minimum for all of the remaining speakers. Our next is Elaine Hobby, a professor of 17th-century studies at Loughborough University. That's Loughbrough. She has worked very happily there for more than 30 years, having in the past edited autobiographical writings and midwifery manuals from the early modern period. She is now leading an international team that is preparing the Cambridge edition of the works of Aphra Behn. Editing is her fascination and her joy. You'll also note that I had a little coaching from Elaine on properly pronouncing Loughborough after the Pitt Sligo debacle. And the best possible phonetic guide that her students use for their magazine clubs, etc., is simply to spell it out, Loughborough. 2 syllables, stress on the first one. Elaine, thanks.
So, you have a piece of paper, which I suppose might be a very appropriate way to introduce something that has a grant, which is called Editing Aphra Behn in the Digital Age. So I should make it clear, I'm not talking about a digital edition, I'm talking about editing in the digital age. So it's a paper edition. There are digital dimensions to it, which I'm going to talk about, but this is a paper edition. So, piece of paper for you. 2 sides of the piece of paper, which they tend to have, in fact. And on the top, you can see really everybody who's involved with the edition. And on the other side are some examples that I'm going to speak about briefly. It's quite interesting to find myself in this context talking about a Behn edition, because probably, for most people in this room, she is the least well-known figure. And therefore, part of the purpose in giving you this piece of paper is showing you the range of what she wrote. So she didn't write only Arunico and the Rover, which are the 2 texts that are often taught in universities. She did a great deal else. You can see there are probably 20 plays. There is poetry, hundreds of poems. There's fiction, including fiction translated from the French. And there are letters, including her spying letters. So a huge project, which we intend to have finished within 5 years, which in the light of everything you've heard so far sounds like insanity. And I did like this morning references to how an individual personality might drive something through. Well, that's the intention. Because, of course, editing in the digital age is editing in a very different world, as we were talking about this morning, from the 1950s, 1960s. As Stephen mentioned this morning, the status of scholarly editing in Britain is very different from what it is in the USA, for instance, in Australasia as well, insofar that our regular research exercises that assess us and then decide how much money we're going to be paid to do our research, those research exercises now for the last 3 times in a row have all said the same thing, which is that the absolutely best world-leading research that is being done in the UK is the production of scholarly editions. So we don't have a problem persuading either our managers or funders that undertaking the making of an edition is not a respectable thing to do, which is a great thing. So my project has a grant of £752,000. Sounds like a lot of money, but most of it has gone to university administration. Yes. But most of the work that's being done by the edition is being done by academics and retired academics who are doing it as part of their job or as part of what retirement is for, which is to do research. At least that has always been my view. So funded, but funded as well simply as part of, if you like, ordinary higher education activity. But in a system where if, again, certainly in Britain, if young academics don't have their publications, then they won't get jobs. They won't keep jobs. And so the timeline is essential. And what I did as the funding for the project started was to get all of my editors together. You can see there are a good number of them, that there are their names after the text they're editing, to ensure that the older people in the room, so people of my generation, understood that it was the real lives of the younger people in the room that they were compromising if they took their time over what they were doing, that they needed to get on with it. Digital editing in the digital age for us is involving many wonderful things. It isn't involving something that I dreamt of to start with. Our funding includes the possibility of building an electronic workbench. The idea was that editors would all do their editing through the workbench, that people would be able to access one another's texts as they were working, that we would be able to keep an eye on everyone and see whether they were actually getting on with it. And that also there would be all kinds of facilities for editors to search one another's notes, to learn from each other. What became clear after about a year, as the people we were working with were building this, is that only editors understand what it is that we're really doing. And if you try to explain to a computer person what you want them to do, you find, for instance, they produce a system where if you're annotating a phrase or a word, and you've said that you want there to be a link between the different annotations on this same phrase or word, the computer will, at least with the program that was written for us, only ever allow you to annotate that word or phrase in identical ways, which is not what editors do at all. That side of things doesn't work. We will write about that. But of course, in the digital age, where you have Dropbox and email and all of the sort of file sharing activities, you don't necessarily need it anyway. We will be making available the complete text of all of Ben's work on the public-facing website, so that will be available, but the books will be available for purchase, or we hope reading in libraries. One of the major digital dimensions of the project, though, was the question of attribution. If you look at the first side of this piece of paper, you can see that there are asterisks against some of these texts. So if you look at the top left-hand corner, you can see against the debauchee and the counterfeit bridegroom, there are asterisks. Down at the bottom of that column, the younger brother has an asterisk, and so on. These are works of questioned attribution. They've often been attributed to Ben, they may or may not be Ben's. And one of the things that we decided we would do from the beginning is that we would interrogate these not only with conventional literary critical means and historical means, but we would also work in the digital age. So Hugh Craig, who, as you can see in that little box in the middle, is part of our editorial board of the University of Newcastle in Australia. Hugh Craig trained a couple of my colleagues in using his digital methods to analyse texts. If you know about these, you'll know that amongst the things that are done is an analysis of the most frequent words in a text, and, for instance, calibrating those against the most frequent words in a basket of comparative texts of the same kind from the same period. You find that particular authors may be more or less inclined to use words or phrases than the comparison, and you can begin to build a profile. Or there are many other tests. I could talk a little bit more about that. This is outside my expertise. I'm responsible for it, but it's not my expertise. But we decided we would examine these texts using these digital methods as well as our literary historical ones. The agreement from the beginning was that those of us who were going to use conventional literary historical methods were not allowed to say to our digitally aided colleagues what our own view was of these various texts, because they had to run these tests clean and clear. I did manage to maintain that, apart from in relation to, you can see in the third column, volume 6 consists of love letters between a nobleman and his sister, the attribution of which to Ben has been challenged. It wasn't It wasn't published in her name in her lifetime, but from the 1690s on, it was always published as hers. And I did say in the hearing of my colleagues that if it turned out not to be by Behn, I would eat a copy. And since only 2 copies are known to be extant of the second volume, that was really quite a statement. And, but I can assure you it is Behn's, and not only according to my way of assessing the method. Interestingly to me, and perhaps more generally in 18th century scholarship, I think, is that quite a lot of the posthumous material that is generally attributed to Behn isn't hers. So if you look down the second column there, you can see that there's posthumous fiction attributed to Behn. Most of that certainly isn't hers. I do not understand how any human ear, having read Behn, would hear it as Behn's. It's a completely different series of voices. It's not even all one voice. And the tests all indicate that that's not Behn's. But it's published under her name after her death, as part of establishing an 18th century understanding of who she was and what her significance was. It's in the edition because we undertook from the beginning that what we wanted to do was to make available to scholars materials associated with Behn, materials thought to be Behn's, because they don't exist in any other scholarly edition. And although the question of attribution is of great importance to us, firstly, we may well be wrong, and therefore throwing things out on the basis that we're not convinced that they're hers is not necessarily a wise course of action, but also our readers really might not care who it's by. They just might want a good edition of this material. The same goes for the various plays in here and so on. It's possible that other editors in the room will later lynch me, because what I've just said is anathema to people who are trying to protect or produce the writings of an author. I shall find out later. But so everything that's on this sheet of paper is in the edition. In terms of using digital methods, we have some quite easy problems with Behn compared with everything else we've heard about today. We have almost no manuscripts. We have, in the case of almost all of the texts, only one lifetime edition, or early posthumous edition in some cases, not even lifetime. So many of the kinds of problems that other editions have working in the period of trying to decide what to take as copy text, whether it's the earliest one, comparing it to other ones in the lifetime, whether it's the last one, how you square this with changes to the manuscript. These are not our problems, which is part of why we can say that we will be done in 5 years. On the other hand, what we have is an edition where many different booksellers, many different printers were involved, and therefore a great variety of insight into how printing happens and how bookselling happens in the period through the figure of Behn and the range of her oeuvre. One of the things that we nonetheless have to do, of course, is to compare copies, because there are stop press corrections, and as most people here will probably know, paper is very expensive in this period. So if there are errors on a sheet that's been printed, you don't throw the sheet away, you just quietly bind it in with some other sheets and assume that nobody will notice because paper's too expensive to throw away. So in order to work out what is there or should be there in the lifetime edition, we needed to collate. And then that's sort of where some of the pleasures of the digital age come about, because maybe you can see here, that's a transparency produced very simply from the early English books online, copy of the play, scaled so that it's exactly the same size as the real book, which of course the Ebo copies aren't. And then you go into a library, you lay it over the opening, and you find changes and find your stop press corrections. That may sound to you like the kind of thing that nobody in their right mind would do, but you'd be surprised what you find. And so that's where you now turn the sheet. And I give you my favorite example. of what we found. I'm quite pleased that this is at Harvard, given that what Gordon was just talking about in terms of the great competition between the two universities. This is from the dedicatory epistle to Behn's play, The Roundheads. The play is dedicated to Henry Fitzroy, as it says on your piece of paper, Duke of Grafton, who is one of Charles II's illegitimate children with Barbara Castlemaine. And the dedication ends with this flourish about the royal line that Grafton is part of. So you can see, and also Grafton has just got married and had a baby. So she talks about the princely race as numerous and beautiful, and those all loyal supporters of a long race of monarchs of the sacred line. All copies I've seen of the Roundhead says that, apart from the one at Harvard. The copy in Houghton, if you look at the next one, you can see, is that these are a long race of monarchs from the sacred loin. Yes. Now, whether that is a Republican printer who's had a naughty moment before his proofreader catches it and has the correction made quite quickly, because I say I've only seen one copy with the error, whether it's the person reading the manuscript aloud has got a West Country accent and the compositor mishears, I don't know. But we found less entertaining examples than that, but there is an example for you. As I say, there are very few manuscripts. I think I may have said none. There's a manuscript of a poem. There are few manuscripts other than that. And the next example is a manuscript which has contributed a great deal to the way in which Behn is thought of. If you've read anything about her, heard anything about her, you probably have been told that she ended her life desperately poor, probably with the pox that she probably got from Rochester. There is no evidence for any of this. One of the two pieces of evidence of her poverty is this promissory note. And this is in the Folger Shakespeare Library. And she's borrowed, you can see there in the top line, £6. What she's effectively doing is borrowing the money from the United Company, the theatre company that she's writing for, through Zachary Baggs, who's the deputy treasurer. She borrows it, see it's there dated on the 1st of August, 1685, and she says, if I've not paid this back by Michaelmas, which is not very far away on the 1st of August, then you can take £5 out of what I'll make from my next play. This apparently is evidence that she was desperately poor. But I think what she was doing was funding the second volume of Love Letters, which comes out at exactly this point, and it's printed for the author. But be that as it may, £6, of course, as we all know, is, for a woman of Behn's level, probably about 2 months' income, at a time where there's no working bank system. If you suddenly wanted to borrow 2 months' income, and you didn't have a credit card, where would you get it from? Well, you know, this is not, what I'm saying to you is this is not actually evidence of what it's been used as evidence for. So even though we have very few manuscripts, I think they have been misread. The next example on your sheet is one where really I'm looking for some help or other examples, because you can see it's headed postscript. And it's the postscript that appears at the end of Behn's best-known play, The Rover. The Rover, published, well, first acted and published in 1677, as you may know, was in some ways based on Killigrew's play Tomaso from the 1660s. It also makes quite extensive use of a play by Broome from that was first published in the 1650s, but that's not been picked up on. And it makes use of the Decameron, and it makes use of various other things. And I've edited this play. It's a great joy of editing. The postscript, which is printed immediately after the epilogue in the edition, says the play would have been sooner in print had it not been for a rumour about the town that was Tomaso altered. And she goes on to defend what she's done. You can see about maybe 4 or 5 lines up from the bottom of the postscript, talking about the critics, who are naturally so kind to any that pretend to usurp their dominion. So she knows that she's being attacked and will be attacked by the critics. And you can see the phrase there, especially of our sex. So that she's saying that I as a woman, or we women, are much more likely to be attacked by the critics. That's quite an interesting phrase, because in most of the extant copies of the play, and I've seen, I think I've seen 30 copies now, and there may be another 8 or 9 that I haven't seen. So I've seen a very large proportion of the extant copies. That phrase, especially of our sex, is not there in any but 3 of the surviving copies. Something else that is peculiar about this play is that it's published anonymously, which is not it's Behn's 5th play. The previous 4 are published with her name on. This one is published anonymously. And the great majority of copies that survive, about 20 of the 30 I've seen, have got the original title page, which has no name on it. There are then 2 other states of the title page, and in both cases they're not conjugate with the rest of the book. So the original title page has been cut off and another one has replaced it. In one of them, it doesn't say what is conventional in the period as it is acted by, in her case, the Duke's company. Instead it says as it was acted. So that's a bit peculiar. But then in the 3rd version that exists, it adds her name, by Mrs. A. Behn. As far as I'm aware, there are only 3 copies in existence of the version that has her name on the title page. 2 of those have this especially of our sex version of the postscript. One of them doesn't. One of the copies of the play that doesn't have her name on does have especially of our sex on it. So my current speculation is whether what I might have stumbled across amongst surviving copies is whether the especially of our sex copies were presentation copies. So are these copies that she gave to women who she knew, and thus add the phrase, especially of our sex? But one of them, as I say, which has her name on the title page, doesn't have especially of our sex. Perhaps it was a presentation copy to a man. Now, I've tried this idea out in various forums. Nobody has ever said to me, oh, that reminds me of such and such that I've come across. But if anyone here has come across a case where presentation copies have this kind of variation in, I would be very interested, very interested. So the digital method, if you like, makes the discovery of this sort of thing quicker and easier. It also, by the by, gives you the sort of thing that's there in the final passage there. And again, I'd love your view of the dating of that hand. It's not as early as a 17th century hand, I don't think. This is a moment in Behn's History of the Nun, where a young woman entered into a nunnery at the age of 3 by her father, then falls in love as a teenager. She leaves the nunnery, she marries for love. Very bad idea. The crops fail, the horses kill each other, and marriage for love is not going to work. So she says to her husband, I think you'd better go off to war. And he says, yes, I think I should too. We need to get back on with the family. And the husband goes off to war. His name is Vilnoise. And he's killed. So she does 7 years of mourning, as a good wife would. And she then remarries. She marries for money. She lives a fine life, very well respected in the local community, lots of charitable work. One day the second husband is going out hunting, as men of that rank did, and whilst he's out hunting, there's a knock on the door, She opens the door, and who's on the doorstep? Of course, it's the first husband, didn't die at all. So she has the second husband come into the house, says to him, you look terrible. You clearly need to sleep. Takes him up to the bedroom. He lies down. He falls asleep. She smothers him. And the second husband returns from hunting. And she says to him, you'll never guess what happened whilst you were out. First husband came back, and I told him that I'm now married to you and I'm in love with you. He died of shock. So the second husband says, leave it to me. I'm a real man. I'll get rid of the body. And he puts the body of the dead husband into a sack, loads it onto his back. And she says, hang on a minute, there's something hanging out. And she gets a needle and thread. And I especially like this feminine moment. She gets a needle and thread, and she stitches the coat of the second husband to the sack containing the first husband. And she says to him, right, well, when you get to the bridge, make sure you give it a good swing so that it'll, really go over. And you can see just a little bit on the page here. So she said to him, make sure you give it a good swing. And I'll warrant you, said Villenois. I know how to secure his falling. And going his way with it, love gave him strength. And he swings the sack and he drowns. So our reader of the Princeton copy has written underneath this little incident, oh, woman, woman, dear damned, invented sex. Splendid. You see, so collation is a lot of fun, whatever method you're using. So collation aided by that, moving as fast as possible for the reasons I've outlined. We were hearing this morning about details about annotation and who you're addressing and a sense of and I was very interested in that because something that we agreed with our edition quite early on is that the annotation that we will provide on the page is intended to inform a reader who may not be interested in Behn, but who might be very interested in the period, because our goal is to bring more readers to Behn. And therefore to have people think that, I think there's an incident in a Behn play, whatever. I wonder if the edition may solve this problem that I've got, which is actually about Dryden or whoever. So there is a lot of annotation on the page, along with an absolute rule, which is that you mustn't steal the page from the author. There must be no pages on which the annotation is taking up more space than the author herself. And it doesn't matter how you get there, you're just not that interesting. Just get off the page, which is kind of what I've said to various of the editors at one time or another. Just looking at the shape of this piece of paper, the front page for a moment, you can also see some other elements of what it means, I think, to edit in the digital age. I said at starting that the speed of finishing is important to us, along with, of course, getting it right. And if you look at the personnel here, you can see that I've listed as the core team 4 general editors, one of whom is myself, one is Claire Bowditch. If you look down that box, you'll see that Claire Bowditch is one of our funded postdocs. It was a matter of principle to me that what she was bringing to the project in terms of her PhD experience and her postdoc experience was of equal value to that of the people working on the edition who were at a further career stage. And so, and Cambridge seemed to accept that this was okay as a position. So Claire is both a postdoc and a general editor on the edition, which of course is essential, really, in terms of working in this digital age where there is little money and no time. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Our third and final speaker on this panel is Michael Suarez Sj. He's a university professor of English and director of the Rare Book School at UVA, a leading institute for teaching the history stewardship of manuscripts, books, and digital materials. He recently completed his term as a Distinguished Presidential Fellow of the Council on Library and Information Resources in Washington, D.C., and was nominated by President Obama to the National Council on the Humanities. His TED Talk, Glorious Bookishness, Learning Anew in the Material World, is a spirited defense of the physical book. Michael is editor-in-chief of Oxford Scholarly Editions Online, co-general editor of the collected works of Gerard Manley Hopkins in 9 volumes, and with a group of 18th century colleagues is co-general editor of the Oxford edition of the writings of Alexander Pope in 24 volumes. In March of this academic year, he will deliver the A.S.W. Rosenbach Lectures in Bibliography at the University of Pennsylvania. And his talk for us today is entitled, What Might It Mean to Edit a Book? Pope, Poesis, and the Possibilities of Bibliography.
I'm deeply honored to appear in such company. In 1991, after a long interval, David Foxon's magisterial 1976 Lyell Lectures were finally published with the help of Jim McClaverty. If you want to know who the informing genius of the new Pope edition is, it's David Foxon and these lapidary Lyell Lectures, which changed how we understand Pope and his relationship to the printed book. And I recommend most warmly this work of scholarship to you. It's also true that a liminal event for me was the publication of Harold Love's Poems of John Wilmot, which begins by saying every editor edits with an idea of the author in mind, and you can either be explicit about that or tacit. It's much better to be explicit, and I, Harold Love, am editing Rochester as a scribal poet. But this idea is very important. In each case, the editor's particular interest in the writings absolutely influences the way those writings are edited. For the Pope edition, the fundamental idea is that for Alexander Pope, poesis does not merely mean creating lines of poetry, but rather poesis means the making of books of poetry. And so this making is multi-stage process and includes the production of textual artifacts. It's also true that for Pope, publication was often a stage in the evolution of a poetic text. And so for our edition, we are not publishing a chronological edition, but rather grouping the poems, as you will see, by their publishing projects. And this seems to me to be absolutely germane. So here is I apologize for the typeface. I created this in a Mac, and this is not a Mac, and it's created some barbaric thing here, which as a bibliographer I find reprehensible, but here it is. So, but the team is really important. McClaverty, Rumbold, Walsh, Woodhausen. Interestingly enough, all people who made their academic careers entirely in the UK, apropos of the discussion, and the one Yank who lived and worked in the UK for 18 years. So this is very much a kind of British edition, and we went to the Oxford University Press. Here you can see the advisory board, including some of the august personages in the room. So just to refresh your memories, The Twickenham Edition was conceived in 1932 and completed in 1969. Okay, been since 1969, a magisterial, wonderful work of scholarship, although profoundly inconsistent in its editorial rationale from volume to volume. But still a foundation of Popian study for virtually everybody in the room. But also, please remember that it's been since 1956 since George Sherburne came out with his marvelous correspondence volumes, since 1956. So we know of at least 95 new letters by Pope and to and from Pope since then, and we think that once we start looking, we'll probably find about 50 to 150 more. The copy texts for the poems will invariably be print, particular editions, I'll talk about that. The copy text, wherever possible, for the letters, however, will be manuscript, but we will always countenance the subsequent publication and reception history of those letters as an integral part of Pope's and Curll's self-fashioning. So please bear in mind, some of you may never have even looked upon this edition. This is the last collected works of Alexander Pope. First volume published in 1871, the last one in 1889, Elwyn and Courthope. And there is much, much good in this that has been neglected by modern scholarship. But it's also, of course, 130 years old. So we will stand on the shoulders of giants, but at the same time, also seek to recover what has been done before. It's also true, as we were beginning to think about the folly, the sheer folly of mounting a new edition of Alexander Pope in 24 volumes, we knew that the Longman edition was in progress, and we knew that Valerie Rumbold had done such wonderful work on the Dunciad, and that indeed Julian Ferraro and Paul Baines were working hard on the very early poems. We had extensive conversations both with the Longman editors themselves, with Oxford University Press, and with the company that now owns Longman about our own edition, to make sure that we were not truncating in any way the scholarship or the scholarly careers of other people if we were going to mount this new initiative. So that to me is very important. But remember, the principles in the Longman edition are very different, very useful, and of course they're always presented chronologically. So here is the team as it now stands. You can read very well, but you'll see, just to point out, these first two volumes are the 1717 poems, which we regard as one of those hinge moments in Pope's career, the final form of Pope's changing his poems up to a certain point. Think, if you will, of the three principal instantiations of the Rape of the Lock, for example. Also, the 1735 works provide another one of those threshold moments in Pope's career, a kind of finalizing of his poetic texts. You also see that of the 24 volumes, 6 of those are allocated to the Iliad and the Odyssey. That's an expensive decision, and we're hoping that some people will read the Iliad and the Odyssey because that's the risky bit as much as anything else, it seems to me. The first volume that will come out very likely is the Ethic Epistles by Marcus Walsh and Hazel Wilkinson, although I think probably volume 2, The Temple of Fame and the Early Translations and Miscellanies, might also contend for first out of the barn, as it were. For us, we really want our edition to be the outworking of a community of scholars rather than an accumulation of separate projects. So we're meeting, the general editors are meeting with the volume editors regularly. We're using the affordances of the digital to stay in touch all the time, to share scholarship, and to even make maximum use of a larger 18th century community of scholarship and indeed of scholarly editing. The idea of the humanities relying on the lone scholar in the carrel in the basement of the library, that romantic genius, is not a good idea. And it hasn't been for a long time. Our model is that the humanistic research should be much more like scholarship in the social sciences. It should be much more collaborative. And this edition is essentially about a community of scholars working in productive resonance with one another. So we've deliberately not commissioned the whole enterprise for a number of reasons, because good people may well come along who we hadn't thought of and we wanted there to be room. But it's also true that our aim is to produce the whole edition in 15 years, which is a very ambitious way of thinking about it. But we know that not all the editors who are currently working on the project are likely, if the actuarial tables are true, to be alive even in 15 years. And so we don't necessarily want to force the hand of our successors, but rather we think a certain studied gradualism is a wise and a prudent course to let a new generation of scholars have a stake in the edition. This is Hogarth's, of course, plate from Industry and Idleness, and it's the two prentices. And we are trying to build in a prentice, or if you will, journeyman, journeywoman system in our edition, so that younger scholars who work on the early books that come out of the edition will then become the primary editors of later volumes in the edition, like so many monarch butterflies making their way to Mexico and the warmth of the winter there. I repeat this slide not for its content, but for, in this case, its shape, if you will. One of the things that we've done, because the raison d'etre of the edition is Pope as a maker of books, and so Pope thought that the proper form, the best form for publishing poetry was large quarto. He hyper-designed the 1717 and 1735 works as large quartos. The folios are kind of spin-offs because of problems of cultural property and Tonson. And so fittingly, the Oxford University Press has agreed that the 24-volume edition will be published in large quarto, and Foxon's book itself is a modern large quarto. So there's a nice squaring the circle there, methinks. It's also true that the edition will have a digital life on Oxford Scholarly Editions Online, known to some of us as OSCIO. But we've also been inspired, mentioned earlier by somebody, by the Cambridge Ben Jonson. And for my money, one of the very finest scholarly editions to appear in the last 40 years is that Cambridge Ben Jonson. It is really magnificent. But it exists in a double valence between the printed volumes and a very capacious website. So we are having not only our volumes published by Oxford University Press in quarto and published by Oxford University Press in Oxford Scholarly Editions Online, but also we will have an attendant website modeled upon the Cambridge Ben Jonson, which we will use to give the public a great deal of material that was not appropriate to reproduce, or was not possible, perhaps, to reproduce in the printed volumes themselves. However, the textual essays for the Ben Jonson have all been relegated to the web, whereas for us, of course, answering that fundamental bibliographical question, how did this book come to be the way it is the beginning of every headnote about every item in every bit of the edition, because the edition is about bookmaking, and the edition is trying to lay down a marker, if you will, not only to help revivify the reading of 18th century poetry in our time, but also to get people excited again, particularly in North America, about the enterprise of scholarly editing. Which is seen often as a dusty, dry as dust activity relegated to some kind of second-class citizens in the academy. We would like to change that. And we would like to change that by saying the new critical bibliography and the rise of book history makes scholarly editing not a mere handmaiden of literary study, but rather integral to the study of textual artifacts as part of human history and as markers of human aspiration and achievement, and therefore is absolutely germane to who we are as humanistic scholars. To prescind from the bibliographical and the editorial is to be a false humanist, just as it was in the 19th century to prescind from philological engagement. And so the marker that this edition attempts to lay down is highly ambitious, but it seems to me vitally important. There are questions. There are questions that now in its nascent stages the edition is leaving unanswered, but about which you may have clear and distinct Lockean ideas. On the left, you will see the Reverend Dr. Swift, and Swift is the marker here for all the scriblarians. To what degree are any of Pope's productions collaborative enterprises? We don't know. And how would contemporary scholarship, perhaps by using some of the affordances of the digital, perhaps by good old-fashioned slog work and careful digging in the archive, how would we find out that we know, for instance, that Pope said repeatedly the Dunciad could never have happened if Swift had not visited him twice and had had a hand in that. And yet, that has not been sufficiently countenanced in any real way by the Academy. To the right, you have Warburton. And yet, of course, the new Dunciad and the Dunciad in 4 books, and of course the 1751 works, Warburton's intelligence is thoroughly imbricated in every jot and tittle. And so we need to figure out, how do we handle the historical collations, and how do we handle the ham-fisted hands of Warburton and his moralizing of Pope's works. And what do those textual intrusions teach us, but how do we think about them in productive ways as critical editors? Please, please, please remember the Greek. The kritikos is the man who sits in the seat of judgment. He's the one who must decide. And so in a case of someone like Warburton, we have to say, what harm has he done? And yet at the same time, how do we acknowledge what his contribution to the advancement of the Popian project actually was? Boy, I hate this typography and what it's done to my page. Commentary must arise from the fortuitous discoveries of the many men, in devious walks of literature. So, of course, if Foxon is the presiding genius, I want to acknowledge some other important geniuses whose scholarship over the last 30 years have informed, deeply informed, transformed our thinking. People like Donald Francis Mackenzie, like J. Paul Hunter, like Vincent Coretta, like Alison Murray. And so I recommend these critical works to you because they have informed our thinking about textual artifacts and the way that materiality and culturally instantiated meanings are inextricably linked. So it is true that if you are editing Alexander Pope for the 21st century, you really have to do a lot of work to put texts in contexts because you cannot presume anything like the learned reader that the Twickenham edition does. So here's a brief kind of program of what some of those contexts might look like. How felicitous. You didn't know I was an avant-garde poet as well, did you? So Melvin New talks about annotation very helpfully as positioning the reader on the brink of interpretation. And so we are hoping that our annotation will do exactly that and no more, that it will have a disciplined and spare quality to it, but at the same time, there's a lot of explication nonetheless that needs to take place. But we come back to this question of editing books, editing artifacts, editing textual artifacts. What does it mean? What might it mean in the 21st century to edit a book and not just to edit a text? This is the central question that we're wrestling with. Of course, it means in part reproducing all the bespoke head and tail pieces that Pope himself commissioned because they are absolutely germane to the way that the text makes its meanings, certainly. But is that enough? And of course, we're editing punctuation and italicization and capitalization and all the things that a textual scholar does. But we're wrestling with the 1735 works and its mise en page, again, designed by Pope as a collaborative project with his printer editors and with some of his dearest friends. And given the care that's gone into this, would we just reproduce this in facsimile? Well, certainly not. But how would we give a reader an understanding of the way that these poems made their meanings in 1735? And why is that important if, for Pope, you think that poesis means the making of books? Of course, the case of the Dunciad brings this all into profound relief. Here you see Pope's, the Dunciad Variorum, Pope's great mock book, right? A mock book that's never been thoroughly successfully edited to intervene into the mise en page of Pope's text is to destroy the joke. It is already to fracture what has been so carefully put together. And so it's also not to understand the way that Pope's Dunciad Variorum is profoundly inflected by the works of Boileau that appeared not much earlier in 1716. And here you see, not my scholarship, but Jim McClaverty's scholarship, the way that Boileau's second satire has the remarks and the imitations in much the same way that the Dunciad Variorum does. And what does it mean that Pope deliberately puts his book in residence with the collected works of Boileau? And why is that important? And how is that the kind of physical intertext running like a bright red thread through the whole poem. So for the Dunciad Variorum, at least, we will print rectos on rectos in full facsimile and versos on versos, and not intervene in the text at all, which presents the challenge of matching for the annotation. Here's the canvas for annotation. So to match spatially, right, but never to go over, because you have to make it work this way, because versos will be on versos. So Pope's complex, as it were, mock book is preserved in its integrity even as it's explicated by its poor servant, the editor. We've learned a lot along the way so far. Elwin and Corthorpe, in their Dunciad volume, as an example, had a manuscript. They had a manuscript that they refer to a lot, and it wasn't one of the two Broglios in the Berg collection. It has overlap with those two, and we decided to go looking for it. And this is the manuscript that Elwin and Corthorpe had. And the reason why nobody knew it was around was because it was in Four Oaks Farm. And Mary Hyde bought it. And now it's at Harvard. I was deeply fortunate enough to discover this at Harvard, not through my own ingenuity, but because of the kindness of a curator. The librarians often know so much more than the so-called scholars. Turns out that Edmund Malone copied Jonathan Richardson's copy of the manuscript, which had been copied into a copy of the Dunciad, and eventually Croker got it, and then eventually Mary got it, of happy memory, and now Harvard University got it. Take that, Yale. But we'll also be collecting although the book is the edition is about book making as a form of poesis and the centrality of materiality in the making of culturally instantiated meanings that are durable over time and can be recovered. It's also true that we're keenly interested in kind of collecting all the annotations to the Dunciad because it's a kind of poem à clef. And here, in a little shout out for the Lewis Walpole Library, is a copy of Dunciad Book 4 with Horace Walpole's annotations. So I guess what I would like to emphasize is if I go to your house and you feed me McDonald's or Popeye's chicken, I'm going to be insulted. I'm interested in a home-cooked meal. I believe in the slow food movement. And so, too, I believe in the slow knowing movement. I think that making a 24-volume print scholarly edition in the second and third decades of the 21st century is a testimony to the fact that real expertise takes time. That to move from data to information to knowledge, and maybe even to wisdom, is the core of the humanistic enterprise. And from the late 17th century, scholarly editing has been part of the guarantee of the transmission of cultural heritage to new audiences in responsible ways, so that the record of human aspiration and achievement, of greatness and of tragedy, might endure. It's also true that the great requisite of scholarly editing is to have a head and not a pumpkin. To have brains and not a pudding in your head. A. Houseman, the great poet, said it best. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. We have a little time for a final round of questions, and if I could ask Elaine and Gordon to come up and hover around the mic, and then if we put you on this side, Michael, we should be all wired for sound. Again, I'll remind you that if you do have a question, please identify yourself by your name before you ask the question. And our first here is Conrad.
Conrad Harper, my congratulations on 3 superb presentations. I want to ask you, Michael, if I may, first about the correspondence, about which you were silent when you laid out the 24 volumes. Is it also going to be in quarto form? Second, I want to ask you about the question of regularization. If you're printing the Nuntiad with 18th century typography, are you doing that for the other parts of the works?
So, two-part question. The correspondence will also be printed in quarto. The whole edition will be uniform in size, and please God, have the same color covers so that no collector is upset about the way it looks on the shelf. But yes, so the copy text for that will be the manuscripts. We do have a policy of adhering to the copy text as printed exactly. And so we will be reproducing with tables of variance, of course, extensive tables of variance. It's a critical edition. But we will be adhering to what we regard, based on a particular Griffiths number, which we will identify. The copy text will always be based on a publicly accessible printed edition, so that any human being who has the edition can go to that library in the British Library of Princeton, depending on what book we use, or even, dare I say, the Beinecke, and we'll be able to go there and to check the actual physical artifact against the scholarly edition to make sure that they agree. So the only way that we'll deviate with that is in the case of special sorts that can't be reproduced. But the answer is no, we will not. I mean, if it's about Pope's hyper design of the book, at a particular stage in the progress of the poem as a kind of public act, then it would be absurd for us to start to change that. And so if Pope is italicizing the noun nature, so shall we, because there's a reason why he's done it, informed by Foxon and so on and so forth. We want consistency of practice. There are 1 or 2 exceptions. For instance, in the 1735 works, Pope does not reproduce the Latin text of his imitations side by each, but he does so in the following year. And we will use the 1735 text, but we will change the mise en page so that we will display the Latin line by line, which was the way that Pope finally fixed it in a post-35 moment. But the answer is no. We believe that if you take the premise of the edition seriously, then it's not our prerogative to start to go in and change the text unless there's an obvious failure by the printer or the proofreader. And that seems to me to be really important, because what we're saying is we're not trying to fetishize the text, but we're trying to say this text makes meaning in ways that haven't maybe been properly acknowledged. You know, I'm an English professor, and I teach almost exclusively poetry now. And I think that if I only teach my students from the Norton Anthology of English Literature, and I've stripped out all the local habitation and a name from all those poems, and the way that they first appeared in newspapers or in pamphlets, or in handbills, or in miscellanies, or authorial works, it's like giving my students a loaf of Wonder Bread to eat and asking them to imagine a wheat field. You know, I've already made it really hard for them to understand the historical nuance and resonance of how the poem came to be in the world and how it makes its meaning in the world. And so our edition is trying to effect an active historical recovery without kind of merely getting a 3D printer, as it were, and you know, giving you some kind of faux 18th century book. So it'll be a full scholarly critical edition, but we will try to stay as faithful as possible to the printed artifact.
Other responses?
Jacob Sider-Jost. Thank you to all of you for entertaining and inspiring talks. This is a question that's mostly for Elaine, although maybe for Michael a little bit as well. You talked about the digital workbench and how that didn't quite come off, even though there are alternate technologies that make a lot of the same things possible. And I'm gobsmacked and awed by the ambition and of the speed with which this is going to happen. And I'm struck by the diversity and range of the contributors, the kinds of contributors that you have. And I'm just wondering about the question of how you build the community of knowledge that Michael, you talked about in the Pope so quickly and across such a geographical range. How do you keep people from replicating the same work? How do you get people to benefit from each other's archival and annotating discoveries? How do you keep people consistent? It's so inspiring, but it also sounds like a logistical, you know, a Freedmen's Bureau plus Marshall Plan plus the Office of Strategic Services.
And it's true that it's, when I thought we could build a workbench that would create some of those opportunities, I thought that would be wonderful because it's not dependent on just the four of us back at base remembering, oh, but, you know, last month we were looking at a draft of this, or I've been in correspondence with so-and-so about that, and there's an overlap here. So largely what we're doing is reminding ourselves and one another that these things exist, and then putting editors in touch with each other, really using email and digital methods to get people to realize that one another are real, and sending copies to one another. I'm always with permission, always contacting an editor and saying, you know, you're dealing with this stuff about how, for instance, widows are meant to like rough wooing, and it's here in these 3 different plays, and you need to talk to each other about the research you're doing on that. So it's very much done with the human intervention. I don't sleep much. But it's completely fascinating. I mean, almost all of the editing I've done until now has been me working with a text. And to be instead in a situation where in the course of a month, you might have 12 different editors sending material in, of their work in progress from different parts of the earth in different genres. It's completely fascinating. It's completely unlike anything I've ever experienced. Yeah. And the Pope is going to be like that as well, isn't it?
I certainly hope so, and I have to say that particularly because she's on my editorial board. So want to keep the editorial board happy. But I also think it's not, you know, it's a terrible misapprehension of our age to think that software will solve our problems, or there's an app for that. You know, good scholarly editing, like good scholarship, is about the Republic of Letters, the Republic of Learning. And so in the Pope edition, part of what we're doing is that each general editor has charge of particular volumes and meets with those editors every 6 months for a progress report, and then is the kind of liaison not only with the other general editors, but then more generally with the rest of the team. And so I would hate to think that Google Docs was a solution to anything except for a trivial problem, right? The real solution is to build a relationship with a group of people and to create a community of trust and to create a community of generosity. And then the rest follows. The sequelae are natural. But I think sometimes we imagine that the digital affordance takes care of the human problem. And that's just arrant nonsense to me. You know, that the human problem is the human problem, and we need to wield ourselves in particular ways to produce certain forms of new knowledge, and that's okay. That's the way people did it 2,000 years ago.
That was what you just said was very moving. And I found this whole day really moving in terms of the human dimensions of everybody's work and the collective dimensions of work that you're all talking about. But this question really, Gordon, is for you, because you said had this wonderful phrase about how the life of Johnson is not a monument, it's a hypertext. And I think that there's this wonderful way that all of these projects are really pushing against this idea of an edition as monumental, which they are. You know, for me, not being someone who works in textual editing, when I look at the Twickenham Pope or the California Dryden, it is a formidable sight. I mean, just seeing all those books. Or it's like when Plum says about Walpole's, Lewis's Walpole, well, it's too heavy to read, right? It's almost like we're just supposed to admire that this work got done, which I realize is ridiculous. But so Gordon, I just felt like, especially since Boswell talks about the life as a monument, and yet it seems like what this understanding of what editing and engaging with the archive really is undoing monuments and opening them up for the future in all these different ways that include, as Michael was saying, the history of people's responses to the text. There are all these different ways that editing is about asking questions, which is not what, when I was a graduate student and looked at these 24 volumes worth of Pope, I figured, oh, well, all those questions are answered then, right? So I wonder if you could just talk about that a little more, because I thought that was very moving, especially to say about the most monumental biography in English, I think.
The meaning of any literary text changes with time. Any given moment in history will reread the texts of the past for different elements and aspects. The monumental is not the same from one age to the other. In states south of here, monuments to people once considered heroic, south of what the late, great Robin Williams used to call the Manson-Nixon line, are coming down. What was once monumental no longer is, or it's a monument to something that was absolutely horrible. You're right that Boswell does refer to the life as a monument in his prefatory material, but in an interesting and revealing way. He thanks all the people who sent him things and says they are like the grateful tribes of ancient nations who came to lay a stone on the monument. Boswell is intuitively aware of the fact that the glue doesn't necessarily hold it all together properly. He's showing you the cracks and the seams. It was a hypertext even in his own time. The second edition of the Life is a shambolic agglomeration of things that came into him later. He produced principal corrections and additions to be made available for a certain cost to purchasers of the first edition. And even then, he was sort of at work on a third edition in his unhappy final years, but it was taken over by Edmund Malone. Even the great Hill-Powell edition of the Life is a mashup. Hill and Powell say the copy text for this is the third edition, the last to have any involvement of Boswell himself during his lifetime, except when I thought the other editions were kind of better. And the first is more lively, and the sixth is more polished, and so forth, so I stuck that in. This is, again, something I felt Boswell intuitively knew about both the life of Johnson and anything ever sculpted, painted, crafted, or written. It will evolve with us. You have to look at the texts from the past and reread them for certain elements the past may not have seen in them.
I'm Tara Wallace. This is actually a question coming out of Stephen's talk earlier. Implicit in Plum's criticism is a kind of value hierarchy, right? That certain people are worth editing and others are not. There are never going to be any questions about Pope. There are never going to be any questions about Johnson. When I was working on Burney, some people would say, why Burney? So I'm wondering if all 6 of you have something to say about deciding whether Akenside, or God forbid Stephen Duck, would be actually worth the kind of effort. At what point do any of you say this person is not important enough for this kind of work?
Feel free to take the mic. Okay.
It's proportionality. Well, it's 2 things, isn't it? Proportionality, and also it's basic economics. Because if you go to OUP saying, I want to do, well, I can think of other examples than Stephen Duck, even more minor, they're going to say, thank you very much, but no. So it probably solves itself. But no one's going to argue about 24 volumes of Pope.
I was pretty shocked that OUP said yes. No, I was, right? I was shocked that OUP said yes, and apropos of the magnificent letter that Gordon showed about with Winship saying, we've got to get it so Yale doesn't, because wouldn't it be great if they had to come to Cambridge to see this? I mean, how childish in some ways. Well, when I went to OUP and said, if we could get the right group of people together, obviously all subject to the approval of the delegates, would you be interested? And they said, well, how big would this be? And I said, it'd be about 25 volumes. And they said, how do you figure that? And we talked about that a little bit, and they said, who are some of your pals? And I talked about some of the people who might be involved, and so on and so forth. And part of the thinking at OUP was, those people in Cambridge stole the Swift edition from us. And so we're going to make sure they can't steal Pope too. And so, I mean, that's amazing to me. I was like, okay, that's great. You can have it. That's wonderful. But that really figured into, they thought, well, if we don't do it, he's going to pick up the phone and call Linda Bree, and then they're going to do it, and then, what will happen to our reputation in 18th century studies? So that was part of it, actually.
A quick word on the case of Burney. This goes back to what I mentioned earlier on about Joyce Hemlow originally presenting it as a 10 or 12 volume project, which I think was a relatively easy sell at the time to Oxford, since there's already a 7-volume edition of her in existence, which went back to her own time. I think it wasn't that hard to make a case for a 10 or 12 volume project, which of course turned into a 12 volume project. It would have probably been much harder for her to make a case for a 24 volume project, which is what it eventually grew into. And so it was incremental. First of all, that 12 volume proposal by Joyce, which was accepted. Then stage 2, Lars Troider's proposal, which was supposed to be for another 12 volumes, but which actually shrunk to a 5-volume set, so again, no problems there. And then finally, a 3rd pitch had to be made, for the court journals as a separate entity, and then a 4th pitch for the additional journals and letters. So unlike quite unlike the Pope, in which a sort of 24-volume pitch was made from the start and was accepted, Burney, as I guess befits her relatively lowly status compared to Pope, had to be done in an incremental process.
We have time for one last question.
Yes. I wonder how each of you imagines the audience for your editions. There's always going to be some unease about that. With Boswell, obviously, how could one not feel unease about the commercial editions of Boswell as opposed to the more scholarly ones? With Behn, there's the question of her importance enough for such an edition, which of course would have been controversial at one time. And I appreciated the comment about the Norton anthology, and I feel completely the unease of teaching from it. But how do you imagine your audience?
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Larry.
Part of what we pitched to Cambridge for the Behn was, which is something we haven't got to yet, but was that through digital methods, people will be able to order off the CUP website their own selection. So, rather like Norton are now doing. And that they will be able to order it either in modern spelling or in old spelling. It's an old spelling edition. And the theory is, therefore, that somebody could decide that for their own teaching, they need a Runico and the Rover and these poems, for instance, and could pull it together and order it. So that was part of the original pitch, was the idea that this would, it would work in relation to the teaching curriculum in universities. And of course, at the same time, trying, as I indicated, to speak to scholars who may not be interested at all in Behn, but are working in that period or in some aspect of that period, and trying to convince them to come to Behn for this, because whatever it is, she has done something about it and we've done some work on it. In 10 years' time, we'll find out to what extent we've guessed that right. So.
Well, a quick answer on the Boswell volumes. The research series first. They are not reading texts. They are research casebooks. This may be heresy in certain circles, but it seems to me the text of Boswell's mostly uninteresting letters are a means to the annotational ends. They're what they make possible. The next volume of correspondence we have coming out with Sir William Forbes is a remarkably detailed window on the growth of modern banking and its relationship to the thinking of the Scottish Enlightenment of the time. These things are connected. Forbes was also a leader of the lay Episcopal community in Edinburgh, one of those things constantly at odds with the Knoxian Calvinism that lacerated Boswell's boyhood. That's what that volume is about. So they are for very specialist scholars in the field and major research libraries and what the business calls legacy collectors. The trade volumes were designed for a more popular readership. To this day, the London Journal of 62-3 remains the most popular and best-selling and widely read and the most commonly taught in college and university classrooms. Those of you in the room who've taught it know that it works very well as a teaching text. There is no overestimating the natural conservatism of youth and the way they take literary judgment to be quick, knee-jerk, frequently knee-jerk, woke, moralistic assessments. And if what you want from a classroom is vigorous, annoyed, opinionated side-taking, there's nothing quite like Boswell to get this going. It works well as an undergraduate teaching text. Let's try and think about why. Here's a young person who's just graduated from university. He gets himself out of parental jurisdiction. His damned father is badgering him to go to law school, but he doesn't want to. He wants to go to the bright lights and big city and cut a figure and be a celebrity and hang out with social eminences and have a following on 18th century Facebook with 1 million clicks and likes and retweets and so forth. But what is not for an undergraduate audience to engage with? The later volumes are a bit more depressing, but they do show what those youthful ambitions do and don't turn into in later age. But that's done. The trade volume is finished. I undertook the Penguin Classics edition because there's a lot wrong with Pottle's 1950 edition that, because of his authority, had never been spotted before. The later volumes, there's only one of them that remains in print, and that's the Laird of Auchinleck, because that one sells quite well in Scotland, where there is a different sort of readership for Boswell's journals from what there is in North America.
Very briefly, at one end, the learned undergraduate, but we hope that a distinguished group like this would be able to go to the pages of the new edition and find new and revealing annotation and headnotes and introductions. But every foreign language will be translated in full. All the biblical allusions, all the allusions will be given. So whether to Shakespeare or the Bible or anything else, because partly we think that people are becoming more interested not just in English literature, but in literatures in English. One of the things that the editorial team for Oxford Scholarly Edition Online did with OUP when we were negotiating our initial contract was we said that, well, we would only come on to do this if so-called second world and so-called third world countries could have access to Oxford Scholarly Editions online, and therefore the corpus of English literature, French literature, German literature that's on there, but plus the Greek and Latin literature at a rate that was proportionate to a financial metric about GDP and average income and the size of universities and so on and so forth, so that there would be some kind of just access to this corpus of text for digital delivery for people. And OUP acceded to our request to do that. Well, if this is going to be part of Oxford Scholarly Editions online, then we need to think about a very bright young student 25 years from now in Ghana who might not have read the text that we were privileged to read as young people, but who could benefit from the explication. And so we're really trying to make sure that Pope is made accessible in new ways by leading people to the brink of interpretation, but not writing journal articles in the footnotes.
On these inspiring pedagogical and scholarly notes, I want to thank you all for spending the day with us on behalf of the Lewis Walpole Library and on behalf of all of the presenters. Thank you for fostering such a vibrant conversation.